Padre Pio spoke one prayer before sleep descended. No demon crossed his threshold through 50 years of darkness. 3 strangers in Scranton now whisper those same words, while terror climbs their spines like frozen fingers. A janitor haunted by childhood screams. A judge drowning in decades of ruthless verdicts. A hospice nurse carrying incense through corridors where death breathes steadily. The prayer exists. The protection is documented. But what it truly guards against will shatter every assumption about where evil actually lives. When midnight comes and the words leave trembling lips, the silence that follows reveals a truth more devastating than any supernatural assault. Lucas Hale's mop handle rattled against the yellow bucket as fluorescent lights hummed their electrical psalm above the empty office corridor on Lackawanna Avenue. 34 years of poverty had carved lines around his eyes that made him look 50, and the night shift at Berkman Industries had become his monastery of exhaustion, where sleep was a luxury he could never afford. The building settled around him with creaks and whispers that might have been plumbing or might have been something else entirely, and his hands shook as they always did after sunset, trembling with the muscle memory of fear that had roots in a childhood bedroom where his father's footsteps had meant pain. He pushed the mop across tiles that reflected his gaunt face in smeared fragments, and somewhere in the fluorescent buzz he heard his own breathing, ragged and shallow, the sound of a man who had forgotten how to rest. The janitorial closet smelled of ammonia and old coffee, scents that clung to his uniform like the poverty that clung to his resume, and when he closed his eyes even for a moment, shadows gathered behind his eyelids with shapes that felt too deliberate to be random. Sleep had become his enemy, because sleep meant dreams, and dreams meant returning to that locked bedroom where small hands had clawed at doors that never opened. Eleanor Whitcomb knelt on an antique prayer bench in her Dunmore mansion, silk robe draped over shoulders that bore the weight of 40 years on the Pennsylvania bench. 62 winters had frosted her hair silver, but her spine remained steel, the posture of authority that had sentenced hundreds to years behind bars, while her conscience accumulated its own prison sentences. The bedroom around her breathed wealth through Persian rugs and oil paintings, insulation purchased with judicial salaries and strategic investments, yet the walls felt thin as paper when midnight approached, and her memory replayed the face of Marcus Delaney, 19 years old, sobbing as she delivered maximum sentencing for a crime his public defender had barely contested. She had been harsh because the law demanded harshness, or so she told herself through decades of similar decisions, but the boy had hanged himself in his cell 3 months later, and ever since, Eleanor heard breathing in her bedroom that did not belong to her aging lungs. Her physician prescribed sleeping pills that she swallowed like communion wafers, chemical grace that only delayed the reckoning until 3 in the morning when she jolted awake with her heart hammering against ribs that felt suddenly fragile. The mansion's silence was not peaceful, but accusatory, filled with the phantom sounds of gavels striking and lives shattering, and no amount of money could purchase the kind of rest that required a clear conscience. Maria Vescovi drove her Honda through Scranton's sodium-lit streets with a bundle of white sage on the passenger seat and rosary beads wrapped around her rearview mirror. 28 years old and already exhausted by proximity to death, she worked night shifts at St. Catherine's Hospice, where the dying taught her that the end was rarely peaceful and often filled with terror at what might wait beyond the final breath. Her grandmother had been Sicilian, superstitious in ways that American education had tried to scrub from Maria's worldview, but 3 years of watching people leave their bodies had restored her belief in things that moved unseen. The incense in her coat pocket was frankincense, purchased from an occult shop run by a former priest who told her stories about Padre Pio and the prayer he spoke every night before sleeping, a prayer so powerful that witnesses claimed his room became untouchable to darkness. Maria was skeptical by training, a registered nurse who believed in morphine and vital signs, but doubt had become harder to maintain after the night Mrs. Kowalski sat up in bed, 3 hours dead, and pointed at the corner where Maria saw nothing but shadows that seemed too thick. She had started researching spiritual protection with the desperation of someone who worked in a building where the veil between worlds wore dangerously thin, and the prayer attributed to Padre Pio, appeared in multiple sources with disturbing consistency about its documented effects. Lucas saw the flyer on the staff room bulletin board during his 2:15 break, pinned between a notice about stolen lunches and an advertisement for used tires. The paper was cream-colored, expensive stock that felt strange among the cheap, laser-printed announcements, and the text was handwritten in dark blue ink with letters that looked almost medieval. It advertised a prayer group meeting at Holy Rosary Church, specifically focused on what the flyer called protective devotions taught by Padre Pio of Pietrelcina, and something in Lucas's chest tightened because he recognized desperation when he saw it reflected in his own exhausted face. He had tried everything else over the years since childhood had ended, but the damage had not, moving through therapists and medications and self-help books that promised healing but delivered only temporary numbness. Sleep remained his nightly battlefield, where old wounds reopened with perfect recall, and he was so tired of being tired, so worn down by fear that had no specific target, but saturated every moment of darkness. The flyer included a phone number, and Lucas found himself dialing it on his next break, standing in the cold stairwell where his breath formed clouds, and a woman's voice answered, warm and certain, telling him that Wednesday night at 7, they would share the prayer that had kept demons from one of the holiest men who ever lived. Eleanor found the same information through different channels, because wealth provided access to private spiritual directors and exclusive prayer networks, where priests spoke freely about miracles they would never mention from the pulpit. Her confessor, Father Dominic Santoro, had mentioned Padre Pio during their last session, when Eleanor admitted that her insomnia had become unbearable, and her fear of sleep had begun to feel like fear of judgment. The old priest had leaned forward in the confessional darkness and whispered about a prayer so specific, so powerful, that it created a barrier against all forms of spiritual assault. And Eleanor had written down the meeting information with hands that trembled, because even she, who had spent decades wielding gavels like weapons, was afraid of what waited in the dark. She had prosecuted cases involving religious fraud and knew how easily faith could be weaponized against the vulnerable. Yet her skepticism felt increasingly hollow when every night brought the sound of breathing that was not her own, and the sensation of eyes watching from corners where her bedroom cameras showed only empty space. Father Santoro had looked at her with something close to pity, and said that sometimes our demons are not expelled, but integrated, not destroyed, but forgiven, and Eleanor had left the confessional wondering if forgiveness was even possible for someone who had spent a career being merciless. Maria organized the prayer meeting with clinical precision, arranging folding chairs in Holy Rosary's basement with the same efficiency she brought to organizing medication schedules and end-of-life care. She had invited 12 people through various networks, selecting individuals who showed signs of what she thought of as spiritual disturbance, people who looked haunted, in ways that had nothing to do with mental illness and everything to do with proximity to something unseen. Lucas arrived first, early by 20 minutes, standing in the church parking lot like he might run, and Maria recognized the body language of someone who had survived trauma and still expected the next blow to land without warning. Eleanor arrived precisely on time in a car that cost more than Maria made in a year, but her face held the same haunted quality, wealth proving useless against whatever stalked her through expensive rooms. Maria had printed copies of the prayer in Latin and English on paper. She had blessed herself with holy water from the church font, and as people filled the basement with their various desperations, she felt the weight of what she was offering, words that claimed power over darkness, but might just as easily expose them all to something worse. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and Maria began by telling them that protection always came with a price, that speaking the prayer meant confronting not just external demons, but the ones that wore their own faces. The prayer itself was deceptively simple, written in Italian by Padre Pio in his own hand, and discovered after his death among personal papers that the Vatican had kept sealed for decades before releasing them to scholars who studied mystical phenomena. Maria distributed the photocopied pages with trembling fingers, and the basement fell silent as 12 haunted souls read words that looked ordinary on paper but felt heavy with accumulated intention. Lucas stared at the Latin version, because something in him wanted the original language, wanted the shape of syllables that had passed through the lips of a man who bore stigmata and was rumored to bilocate. And the prayer was only 7 lines long, but each line felt like swallowing something solid. The English translation spoke of entrusting the night to divine protection, of sealing the threshold between sleep and waking with faith stronger than fear, but the Latin carried rhythms that suggested older traditions, pre-Christian structures of binding and warding that the Church had absorbed and repurposed. Eleanor read with the analytical precision of someone who had spent a lifetime parsing legal language, and she noticed immediately that the prayer made no promises about comfort, only about protection, and she wondered what it meant to be protected from something, if you were never promised peace. Maria explained that Padre Pio had spoken this prayer every night before sleep for 50 years, beginning when he first entered the monastery, and continuing until the night before his death, when witnesses claimed his room filled with the scent of roses, despite winter frost covering the windows. The documentation was sparse but consistent across multiple sources, including testimony from friars who had lived in the same monastery and visitors who had been granted audiences with the stigmatic priest. Several accounts described attempting to enter Padre Pio's cell after the prayer had been spoken and finding the door impossible to open despite no physical lock, or stepping across the threshold and feeling pressure that made breathing difficult, as though the air itself had become dense with presence. One friar had written in a journal that he placed his hand on Padre Pio's door handle after hearing the prayer through the wood and felt burning heat that left no mark, but convinced him that something stood guard that was neither human nor neutral. The Church had investigated these claims with characteristic skepticism and found no fraud, no trickery, only the consistent testimony of reliable witnesses who all reported the same phenomenon, that after the prayer was spoken, the room became inviolable until dawn. Lucas felt nausea rising as he read the words again, slower this time, tasting each phrase like medicine that might heal or poison depending on dosage. His childhood bedroom had offered no such protection, no barrier against the father who entered with bourbon breath and closed fists, and the idea that words could create safety where locks had failed felt simultaneously desperate and intoxicating. He had spent years in therapy, learning that his hypervigilance was a survival mechanism, that his inability to sleep was his nervous system refusing to believe danger had passed, and every technique he had learned focused on convincing his body that threats were over. But this prayer suggested something different, not the reassurance that danger was past, but the active creation of protection against dangers that remained real and present. The difference was significant because it meant acknowledging that the darkness was not imaginary, that his fear was not irrational, that something did watch from corners and breathe in empty rooms. His therapist would call this catastrophic thinking, but Lucas had stopped going to therapy because talking about fear had never made it smaller, only more articulate. Eleanor's skepticism manifested as questions delivered in her courtroom voice, precise and demanding evidence. She asked Maria for documentation, for peer-reviewed studies, for anything beyond anecdotal testimony and medieval superstition, and Maria responded with patience worn thin by 3 years of watching people die badly. The nurse explained that some forms of protection could not be measured in double-blind studies, that efficacy was not always provable through scientific method, and that the choice to speak the prayer was ultimately a choice to admit that control was illusion, and faith was the only currency that worked in realms where logic dissolved. Eleanor wanted to argue, but found herself silenced by the memory of her bedroom at 3 in the morning, the sensation of breath on her neck when she slept alone, the sound of weeping that had no source but filled her expensive silence with accusation. She had built her career on evidence and precedent, on the belief that truth could be determined through proper procedure, but 40 years of jurisprudence had not prepared her for the possibility that some truths existed outside the jurisdiction of reason. Maria told them that the prayer was not magic, that speaking words without intention was just noise, and that the protection it offered required something most people found more terrifying than any demon. She explained that Padre Pio had lived in constant confrontation with his own darkness, that his stigmata were not just mystical gifts, but wounds that forced him to carry the weight of suffering physically, making denial impossible. The prayer worked because it demanded honesty about the darkness within as much as the darkness without, because it required admitting that the monsters were not only external invaders, but also internal residents that wore familiar faces. This was the price that the documents never mentioned, the cost that could not be written on paper, but was transmitted through practice. That protection from demons meant first recognizing which demons were actually fragments of unintegrated self. Lucas felt his stomach drop because he understood immediately what Maria meant, understood that his nighttime terror was not separate from, but connected to the trauma he carried, that the breathing he heard in empty rooms might be his own dissociated fear, given autonomous presence. Eleanor pressed her lips into a thin line, because she too understood that the prayer would not work as shield, but as mirror, forcing her to face not phantom attackers, but the very real guilt that stalked her through decades of harsh sentencing. The basement lights flickered once, then stabilized, and 12 people sat in folding chairs with papers in their hands and decisions pressing against their ribs. Maria instructed them to take the prayer home, to read it 3 times daily for preparation, to fast from meat on the day they intended to first speak it before sleep, and to expect not comfort but confrontation. She warned that the first night after speaking, the prayer was often the most difficult, because the darkness would test the barrier, would probe for weaknesses, and that weakness was always internal rather than external. Some who attempted the prayer reported nightmares more vivid than ever before, not because the prayer failed, but because it worked by bringing suppressed material to the surface, where it could finally be addressed. Others reported profound silence, the kind of silence that comes after long struggle, but that silence required first surviving the noise of everything they had tried to ignore. Lucas folded the paper, with hands that had stopped shaking, and Eleanor placed hers in a leather portfolio, with the care of someone filing evidence, and Maria watched them all with the exhausted compassion of someone who knew that offering protection meant first removing every false shelter they had constructed against truth. Lucas waited 3 days before attempting the prayer. 3 days spent reading the words until they became rhythm rather than language, until he could speak them with his eyes closed and his breath steady despite the fear that climbed his spine like cold fingers. He prepared his studio apartment with obsessive care, cleaning surfaces that were already clean, opening windows to let night air wash through rooms that smelled of poverty and microwaved meals, and as sunset approached on the chosen evening, he realized he was more frightened of this than of anything else he had attempted. The prayer sat on his nightstand, written in his own handwriting on an index card, because the photocopied version felt impersonal, and he had fasted since morning, drinking only water, preparing his body the way Maria had instructed, as though the words required an empty vessel. His apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building where sirens and shouting provided constant soundtrack, urban chaos that normally kept him awake. But tonight the street sounds felt distant, as though his intention had already begun creating separation between his space and the world outside. He knelt beside his mattress on the floor because he owned no proper bed, and the position felt simultaneously childish and ancient, the posture of prayer that predated comfort. Eleanor performed her preparation with ritual precision, treating the prayer like a legal document that required exact execution to be valid. She had fasted, showered, dressed in clean cotton rather than her usual silk, and dismissed her housekeeper early so that the mansion stood empty except for her presence and whatever else might inhabit its expensive rooms. The bedroom she chose for the prayer was not her usual suite, but a smaller guest room on the 2nd floor, sparsely furnished with only a single bed and a wooden chair, because something told her that speaking the prayer surrounded by luxury would violate its spirit. She had spent the day in unusual silence, cancelling her standing dinner engagement and ignoring calls from colleagues, preparing herself with the same focus she had once brought to capital cases, where one mistake could mean life or death. The prayer card sat on the nightstand beside a glass of water and a small candle that she had purchased from Holy Rosary's gift shop, blessed by Father Santoro with oil that smelled of myrrh. Eleanor was accustomed to control, to shaping outcomes through force of will and strategic thinking, but this prayer required surrender, and surrender felt like falling. Maria spoke the prayer in her own apartment simultaneously, creating what she thought of as a triangle of protection, linking three desperate souls through shared intention and synchronized action. She had coordinated the timing through text messages, instructing Lucas and Eleanor to kneel at exactly 9:30, to light candles at exactly 9:35, and to speak the first words at exactly 9:40 when the moon would be visible through eastern windows. The nurse had performed this prayer before, but never with such deliberate structure, never with the sense that she was not just protecting herself, but weaving protection around others. And the responsibility felt heavy as she arranged her altar with incense and holy water. Her grandmother's rosary hung from her bedpost, carved from olive wood in Sicily before Maria was born, and she could almost hear the old woman's voice speaking dialect about the evil eye and the need for constant vigilance against forces that envied the living. Modern nursing school had taught Maria to dismiss such superstitions as cultural artifacts without medical validity, but 3 years of hospice work had taught her that the old country knew things that science had not yet learned to measure. When the appointed time arrived, Lucas spoke the first words with a voice that cracked from disuse and fear. The Latin syllables felt strange in his mouth, shaped by a tongue that had only ever spoken English and poverty's abbreviated dialect, but he pushed through consonants and vowels that seemed designed for mouths more practiced at sacred speech. The candle flame on his nightstand flickered despite closed windows, and the air in his studio apartment changed texture, becoming thicker, pressing against his skin like invisible hands testing boundaries. He felt his childhood terror rising, the familiar panic that usually sent him pacing until dawn, but the words continued flowing, because stopping felt more dangerous than finishing. His father's voice echoed in memory, slurred and venomous, but the prayer pushed against the echo, creating space between past trauma and present moment. Lucas reached the 5th line and his chest tightened, breath becoming shallow, because something in the room was responding, not attacking, but listening, and the attention felt unbearable in its intensity. Eleanor spoke the prayer with courtroom authority, each word enunciated with judicial precision, but her hands trembled against her cotton nightgown because authority meant nothing in this space. The guest room's walls seemed to pulse with her heartbeat, and the candle flame doubled, then tripled in her peripheral vision, creating shadows that moved with purpose across ceiling plaster. She had expected to feel foolish, a rational woman engaging in medieval ritual, but instead she felt exposed, as though the words stripped away every professional defense and left only the frightened child she had buried beneath decades of harsh judgments. The prayer demanded truth, and Eleanor's truth was that she had sentenced Marcus Delaney without mercy, because mercy felt like weakness, and weakness reminded her of her own mother, who had died in a psychiatric ward after 20 years of depression that looked like moral failure. She had built her career on the belief that strength meant hardness, that compassion was luxury rather than necessity, and every harsh sentence had been proof that she was nothing like her mother. But Marcus's face appeared in the candlelight now, young and terrified, and Eleanor's voice broke on the 6th line because she finally understood that her demons wore her own face. Maria completed the prayer with practiced fluidity, her voice steady and low, years of hospice work having taught her to speak to the dying with calm that concealed terror. The incense smoke rose in precise column, despite air currents that should have scattered it, and her grandmother's rosary swayed without being touched, carved olives clicking together in rhythm with her breathing. She felt the prayer settle into the room like weight, like presence, like something that had been waiting for invitation and had finally received permission to enter. The protection was not what she had expected, not a wall of light or angelic guardians, but rather a profound stillness that made everything inside her become visible, including the parts she had worked years to suppress. Her own trauma surfaced with cruel clarity. The night in nursing school when a patient had grabbed her with dying strength and whispered that death was watching her, had marked her, would follow her through every subsequent job until she finally accepted her role as threshold guardian. Maria had dismissed it as morphine-induced delirium, but the words had planted themselves in her subconscious and grown into constant vigilance that exhausted her. The prayer forced her to acknowledge what she had known, but refused to admit, that she was drawn to hospice work, not from compassion but from compulsion, from the need to control what terrified her by staying close to it. The three of them knelt in separate rooms across Scranton as midnight approached, and the prayer's final line hung in the air like suspended judgment. Lucas felt his terror peak and then suddenly collapse, not disappearing but transforming into something that felt almost like peace, the way exhaustion sometimes feels like rest when the body has nothing left to give. Eleanor wept for the first time in 40 years, tears that felt like acid burning away layers of professional armor until only vulnerable humanity remained. Maria extinguished her candle with a breath that felt like releasing years of held tension, and in the darkness that followed, she heard nothing, absolutely nothing, and the silence was not empty but full, pregnant with protection that came not from barrier but from integration. The three of them had spoken words that changed nothing external but shifted everything internal, and when they finally lay down to sleep, the darkness that surrounded them was their own darkness, acknowledged and therefore no longer monstrous. The prayer had worked not by keeping demons away, but by revealing that the demons they feared were guardians of rejected aspects of self, standing at the threshold demanding recognition. Protection came not from exclusion, but from inclusion, not from battle but from embrace and sleep. When it finally arrived, was deeper than any of them had experienced in years, because for the first time in their adult lives, they had stopped running from themselves.